Python variables. Hello everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget we're going to take a look at the most basic fundamental data structure that you need to learn about in Python, or really any programming language, and those are variables. Now we're going to use variables to store information inside of our program, and we're also going to go ahead and write our first program throughout this nugget. So we want to make sure that our program is dynamic, that it can run differently every time it executes, and variables are the key to that. So over the course of this nugget, we're going to start off with looking at a few statements that we want to learn how to write, and that includes the print statement, which is going to allow us to get output onto the screen, as well as the equal sign, also known as the assignment operator, that's going to allow us to populate our variables with data. Then we'll talk about what exactly variables are, why they're important, and what they do in the context of a computer program. And then lastly, like I said, we're going to write our first Python programs. We're going to use variables, we're going to use the print statement, you're going to put it all together and see exactly how it works. Let's get started. Before we begin writing our first program and working with variables, we're going to need to know how to do a couple of different things. And the first one is how we get some information out of our program and communicate it back to the user or the developer somehow. And we're going to use the print statement or the print function to do this first. Now, we're not going to talk too much about how the print function works. I just want to go over the syntax briefly. It's the word print and then an open parenthesis and a closed parenthesis. And in between those two parentheses is the information that we want to print. This is going to cause whatever we put inside there to output out onto the screen so that we can read it and we can see what's going on with our program. This is called a function. And that's real important, as are those parentheses. Remember, computer programming is all about communicating instructions to the computer, so we have to be very explicit. And that means things like vocabulary and syntax are really important as well. So when we use the print function, we're going to include those parentheses. Now, if you're on Python 2.x, you can leave those parens off. You don't necessarily need them, but on 3.x you do need them. I recommend including them since that'll make your program compatible with both 2.x and 3.x, and I think it's a little easier and cleaner to understand what's going on. So don't worry too much about the print function now. We're going to talk about functions and input and output later in this course. But it is important to know how to use this statement so that we can write our first initial program and see it in action. The second little piece that we want to know about going into this is a really subtle and small kind of operation inside of a programming language. You may not even realize that it's a separate thing until you're deep into learning how to program. But the equal sign that we're going to use is going to become real important. Now, it doesn't do much. In fact, what it does is going to seem really obvious while we're working through it, but just tuck in the back of your mind that the equal sign is known as the assignment operator. So it's one of many different operators that you can work with. Things like multiplication, division, those kind of things all have an operator associated with them. Well, this one is called the assignment operator, and all it's going to do is it's going to assign values into our variables. And our variables are what we're working with in this nugget. That's what we want to learn about. So let's talk about that now, and then you can sort of see how the assignment operator works. I'll talk about it more there. Variables are a huge component of any program. I've used the analogy that writing a program is a little bit like baking a cake, getting all those initial ingredients together and mixing them up and baking them. Well, variables are the molecules inside those initial ingredients. It's before the ingredients. They're really, really important to the underlying structure of your program, and you have to understand variables inside and out. Thankfully, they're actually a pretty easy concept, a pretty easy topic, and I don't think you'll have any trouble getting a hold of them once we're done with this nugget. So what's the deal with a variable? Well, if you remember back to algebra class, you might have remembered dealing with variables. That was like the x in your equation, x plus 3 equals 10, and you had to solve for x. A variable is essentially an unknown or a dynamic value. And they work a little bit differently in computer programming. Variables are a place that you can sort of think of to store information or store values. So your computer program, every time you run it, if it always had the same information, it would always run exactly the same unless you somehow introduce some randomness to it. But it would always run exactly the same. It would always execute exactly the same thing, which can be valuable in some cases, but a lot of times we want our program to execute differently based on the input that it receives from the user or from a database or from any other outside source. So the program needs to be taught how to perform its operation, but it doesn't necessarily know the values that it's going to be operating on ahead of time, which raises a conundrum. So what we do is we use variables in place of our commands. As an example, take a look at this quick little function that I have defined here. Now this is obviously way more advanced than what we're working with, but I just want to highlight a couple of points on it. I've called it multiply two numbers, and that's exactly what it's going to do. Is it's going to take two numbers, multiply them together, and use that little print command to spit out the result of the multiplication. Now, if I just said multiply 5 times 7, every time this executed, every time it ran, it would say 35, which doesn't have a lot of value for you and I. We already know what 5 times 7 is. I don't need a computer program to tell me that. But it doesn't say 5 times 7. What it actually says is multiply x and y. So x and y can be any values. In fact, they get passed in right here. So my computer program can multiply any two numbers together. The answer gets stored inside of this variable called result, and then it's result that gets printed out to the screen. So I've got three variables inside this little code statement: result, x, and y. And what this means is that my program is now very flexible. It can execute and multiply any two numbers that I want to send to it, and it will tell me what the result of those two numbers is. Pretty cool, right? Now, we often talk about variables as storing a value or being a place where a value is stored, and that's probably a great way to think about it. But just to get into it a little bit deeper, that's not entirely true. Variables are actually an assignment or a name for a position in memory where that value is stored. So while your program is executing, it's got some memory taken from your computer's bank of memory that it's using temporarily while it's executing, where it can store information and retrieve information on the fly while it runs. And this is different than, say, a database where it stores information permanently. Even after the computer stops running or after the program stops running, that information remains in the database. Memory, called volatile memory, is just temporary storage. It's only alive and it's only populated while your program is executing. You only use this memory when you need it. And a good way to think about that memory is sort of like a big grid inside of your computer. Every little nugget, every little piece of information that can be put into memory can be put into one of these little holes inside of the grid. So if we're storing x and y temporarily to execute our program up here, we're going to put them inside these little squares. Now each one of those little squares has an address that the computer can reference, but it's a little complex and confusing, and it would be difficult for you and I to remember, and it wouldn't make any sense anyways. That address is very generic. So instead what we do is we give that space a name. We say, you know what, call this first little square x and call that second one y, and then store some values in there, and then later when I want to get that value out, I can reference it by the name x or the name y that I gave it earlier. Same thing with the result of my multiplication. I'm storing that, say, over here, and I'm calling it result. So x, y, result, these are variable names. These are the variables that I'm using to store my information. Again, this is a little bit technical. You don't really need to understand this unless you're really getting in deep. So the basic assumption that variables are where you store your values is a good way to think about it. And thankfully, as you'll see in a few minutes here, getting values into those variables, creating those variables and getting them populated is really easy to do. You're just going to use that equal sign like we used up there in multiply two numbers. You're just going to say variable name equals and then supply it a value. Here's a variable called name and I'm setting its value equal to Ben. Here's a variable called age and I'm setting its value equal to 32. And real quickly, just notice how the equal sign, the assignment operator, works. It takes the information on the right-hand side of the equal sign and it puts that into the variable on the left. So that's how the assignment operator always works. You start with a variable name, then an equal sign, and then you have your values that you want to store in that variable. And it doesn't have to be a single value like we did above here. You can have some kind of operation running like x times y, and that resulting value gets stored inside the variable on the left of the equal sign. A couple other points about variables in Python. Variables are implicitly declared in Python. So if you're unfamiliar with this, all that means is that you don't have to declare the variable and then assign a value to it. The variable is declared implicitly right when you assign the value to it. So that statement right there both declares the variable, as well as assigns a value to it, and creates the type of the variable based on the value. That's important to know. Variables are strongly typed in Python. That means that it's important to know what type of value you're storing inside of a variable. This means that if you store some letters, like the name Ben, inside of a variable, and then you try to perform a math operation against that variable, you're probably going to get an error in your program. Then, lastly, just take a look at the quick strong type basic variable types here. We have numeric values, string values, lists, tuples, and dictionaries. And we'll take a look at all of those in action over the course of this series. Alright, you're tired of hearing me talk. Let's go write some code. Let's get our hands dirty and make some of this stuff happen and see it in action. I've got my editor up here and I'm ready to start writing my program. So first, let's going to start real simple like we did before, and I'm just going to use the print function to say hello world. And again, this is a real common starting program for any programming language. It's called the Hello World application, and it's just getting hello world to appear on the screen. Go ahead and save this and find out where I want to save it here. And I'll just call it hello world.py. Go ahead and give it a save, and over here I'm going to say Python hello world.py. Hello world. Okay, so that worked exactly like I had hoped. Now I'm using here that first statement, or that function that I talked about earlier, the print statement. And notice I've got print, open paren, and close paren, and then in the middle is the stuff that I wanted to print to the screen. There it goes. It came right out exactly as I printed it. So it's important to use that syntax exactly the way we have, and it's important to note that we had quotes, in this case single quotes, around the world hello world. And that may not be immediately obvious, but it's important to use those quotes to distinguish in our program between text, or a string literal as it's called, and the variable name that we might be using. So let's see that go right now. If I come over here, and I'll just add a line up above, and I'm going to say hello world equals hello world exclamation point. And then down here, my variable name is called hello world, so I should be able to print out the message that is in it. I'll go ahead and give it a save. I'm going to rerun my command. What do you think is going to happen? Not quite right. It looks right at first, but it's not actually right. Take a look at what happened here. I wanted my message to be hello space world with an exclamation point on the end. But instead what I got was hello world, no space, no exclamation point. That's my variable name right here, hello world, because that's what I did right here. What I actually want to do, what I actually want to give this print function is not with the quotes, but the name hello world. And you'll notice my editor actually colors it differently. It used to be yellow, now it's white. So if I save this and I run it, oops, I get an error. Because I spelled my variable name wrong here. Just come up here, take out that extra W. One more time. Hello world. So now I get it accurately. So let's talk about the difference here. What happened? The print command is going to print out to the screen whatever I put in between the two parens. So if I put a variable name in between those two parens, it's actually going to look up the value of that variable, and it's going to print out the value of that variable on the screen instead of the actual text. So that's what allows me to capture and store information in my program and then do something dynamically based on that information, right? I can print whatever message is stored in my variable that's called hello world. Now, in this example, obviously it's very simple. It's always exactly the same thing. But in a little bit, you'll see how we capture input from the user. Maybe we ask the user for their name, and we store that in a variable called name, and then we can print hello name, and we'll see the person's name come out on the screen instead of the actual variable name. When I did my assignment of this variable, I did use the quotes right here. And that's important because we'll see right now, you can assign the value of a variable into another variable. This right here ensures that I get this actual text value, hello world, into my variable, hello world. Let's take a look though at a slightly more complex example now. Alright, now we're getting crazy. We're up to 12 lines of code. So let's take a look at what I'm doing here. First of all, a quick note, Python is a procedural language. That means that it's going to execute top to bottom right in order. Each statement is going to fire off one by one, and every statement won't execute until the statement above it is complete. It's a little note, but it's important to know. So I'm not doing anything that we haven't seen already. I'm assigning the value bfinkel to a variable called username, and I'm assigning one called Benjamin Finkel to a variable called fullname, and then I'm printing off username and fullname, so we should see both of those come out on the screen. Then down here I've got alt name equals username, and this is what I was talking about with implicit declaration. The variable alt name doesn't exist up here. If I tried to print it up here, I'd get an error. It doesn't exist until line 8, where it gets implicitly created by the fact that I am assigning a value to it. So that way down here on line 11 I can print it off okay. So what's going to happen here, take a guess, is alt name going to be populated with the actual text, the actual letters username, or the value of username? And if you've been paying attention, you know that it should get the value of username assigned into alt name. Conversely, down here in correct name, where I assigned full name to it, I used those quotes. I created a string literal. So incorrect name is not getting Benjamin Finkel, it's getting the actual text full name printed out down here where I say print incorrect name. So when I execute this program, I ought to see bfinkel, Benjamin Finkel, bfinkel, full name come out on screen. Let's make sure it's saved. Go ahead and execute it, and bfinkel, Benjamin Finkel, bfinkel, full name. So just like I predicted, that's how it worked. I want to show off a couple other features of working with variables inside of Python. I can do multiple assignments on one line, so I can say new name equals, let's say username, which equals full name. So now if I come down here, I'll just get rid of this statement and I'll print new name and I'll print username. So what's going to happen here is the value of full name is going to get put into username, and the value of username will then get put into new name. So all three of these values should equal full name. And let's give it a spin. And there it is, Benjamin Finkel, Benjamin Finkel, Benjamin Finkel. So one by one it got executed. The values were put into the left of the equal sign, and that value in turn was put into the left of that. And notice that I've got to use variables on the left of the equal sign. If I try to do something crazy like this, new name equals new name equals full name. If I try to run this, I'm actually going to get an error, and you can read the error very closely here. Let's take a look at the syntax of that error. It says can't assign to literal. So you remember at the beginning, off the top of this nugget, I talked about how important vocabulary was. So I've been using the word assign in the assignment operator very purposefully. I've been using the word string literal very purposefully. It allows you to read these error messages and say can't assign to literal. So what it's saying is it can't assign the value of full name to a string literal new name. That doesn't work. That's an error. As we've been working through this nugget, we've been using only text inside of these variables. Those are called strings in the world of programming, and string refers to a string of characters. So a lot of times programming languages refer to individual characters, individual letters, and then you can work with groups of those letters called a string, and that's what we've done here. But there's a lot of different variable types. I showed off those types earlier in the nugget. Let's take a look at how some of those different types work. Here I'm demonstrating the assignment for each of the basic data types that Python offers. We've got off the top a string, which is what we've been working with all along. That's simply inside of quotation marks. Notice here I've used double quotations instead of single quotes, and that's perfectly acceptable. Single quotes or double quotes work the same. That's helpful if you want to embed single quotes inside of your string itself. You can use double quotes on the outside to define your string literal, and then you can have single quotes inside of your string and they won't get read like quotes inside of the interpreter. Below that I've got an integer defined, and an integer is just like in math, it's a whole number. Now typically integers are within a certain range, a specified range. That depends on your system, 64-bit versus 32-bit, etc. When you need really large, long integers, you can use this long integer variable, it's called, and that's defined simply by putting an L on the end of the integer. Notice that for numbers, you don't need the quotes. The numbers you can just put right into the variable. In fact, if you put the quotes on, that would be a problem, because then you would have a string of the numbers, not the number itself, and you wouldn't be able to do math against a string of the numbers. You have to do math against these little purple values here that don't have the quotes on them. Python also offers the ability to do floating point variables. These are decimal values, like you can see I've got here 1290.60, and it uses Western style notation. It uses points for the decimal. You'll never put commas in your numbers if you're using an integer, a long, a float, etc. Commas can go in strings, but they can't go into numbers. Then I've got three of the collection elements, three of the sequences that Python offers: lists, tuples, and dictionaries. Don't worry too much about how they work. I just want to show off how they can be defined, the fact that they can have multiple different data types inside of them. Then lastly, I just go ahead and print all of them off so that we can see them come out on screen. Let's go ahead and take a look at that now and see what it looks like. Make sure that's saved. Python hello world. And here we are. So it starts off showing off that paragraph that I wrote. This is a string variable. There's 32. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice it dropped the L. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the number, 12,345. That's all we care about in our program. The L was all about memory space reservations. Then there's my list, dictionaries, and tuples printed out, essentially the way that I defined them. And there you have it. That should be everything you need to write a simple, variable-driven Python application or Python program. Okay, that finishes up this nugget on Python variables. So just to recap, we took a look at the print statement and the equal sign, also known as the assignment operator. And we wanted to make sure we know how to do those so that we could both get information out onto the screen and understand how the print statement worked with variables versus string literals, and also how we could use the assignment operator to get a string literal or a number or a tuple or whatever into our variable. We talked about what variables are and how they are simply spaces or memory allocations for data that we want to work with while our program is executing. Variables are the place where we keep our data that we need to use during the execution of our program. And then we finished up, we wrote our first program. A couple of different things. We started with hello world, then we populated some variables, and we started printing those variables out on screen and seeing how we could get information from memory, right, from our variables, out onto the screen so that we could understand what our program was doing. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.